Great. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar hosted by the Invasive Crayfish Collaborative. My name is Natalia, and I'm with Illinois Indiana Sea Grant and am the main facilitator of the Invasive Crayfish Collaborative, which is a program that brings together a variety of experts and stakeholders to address the threat of invasive crayfish in the Great Lakes. We create monthly newsletters highlighting recent crayfish literature and news. We host webinars like this one about new crayfish research and programs, and we work and collaborate with other organizations on various projects, and in general, just try and help promote responsible crayfish practices. So before we begin, I just wanted to quickly share a list of different links that you can follow if you're interested in learning more about the ICC. You can check out our main website, invasivecrayfish.org, which acts as a one-stop shop for invasive crayfish information and is always being updated with more information. If you want to join the ICC membership, you can follow the join link to find our subscription form, and then you'll be added to our Google group, which is used for rapid communication between other crayfish partners in the Great Lakes. And we also send out monthly newsletters and share information about our upcoming webinars and meetings and other events that we have. And if you're interested in registering for our future webinars or viewing past recorded webinars, you can follow the last two links on the slide. And then finally, you can email me at shklaruk@illinois.edu if you have any questions or comments. And I believe Carter is adding these links to the chat so that you can easily access them. All right, so one of the goals of the ICC is to ensure that information on invasive crayfish work in the Great Lakes region is being promoted and is more accessible to the public and to other crayfish stakeholders. This, in turn, will then hopefully make people more informed and will enable them to make better decisions about invasive crayfish management. So in today's webinar, we have crayfish biologist Dr. Premek Hamr here to discuss the status of native and invasive crayfishes in Canada, including the recently introduced marbled crayfish, Procambarus virginalis. And for those who don't know Dr. Hamr, he is a crayfish biologist working in cooperation with Fisheries and Oceans, Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, BC Water, Land and Resource Stewardship, as well as Trent University. And his research centers on the distribution and life history of aquatic and terrestrial crayfish species, as well as the expansion of non-native crayfishes in Canada. He obtained his bachelor's degree at Concordia University in Montreal and his master's degree at Trent University. And from 1985 to 1993, he resided in Hobart, Tasmania, where he obtained his doctorate from the zoology department at the University of Tasmania. As a part of his PhD thesis, he studied the life history of the giant Tasmanian crayfish, which reaches weights of up to 4 kilograms or around 9 pounds for our US attendees. And he's also worked for the Inland Fisheries Commission in Australia, the Canadian Wildlife Service in Canada, Upper Canada College, and Trent University as a lecturer. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Hamr. We're very excited to hear more about your work. So before we begin, just want to remind everyone that you can type in any questions that you may have in the Q&A box or in the chat at any point during Dr. Hamr's presentation, and then we'll go through all of them together afterwards. And then also as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on the ICC website as well as on YouTube with captions. All right, so with that, Dr. Hamr, you can go ahead and begin sharing your screen.
I think I'm there.
I see your desktop, but not the presentation yet.
Yeah, that's right. I'll just have to open that up. And the closed captioning stays in the middle, or can that be moved? I just wanted to ask about that.
So I'm not sure about the closed captioning, but we will be having captions later on in our recording. So I'm not sure if they can move.
Okay. There
Perfect.
we go. Probably not. Just have to get rid of all the boxes that are in my way here, and I'm ready. So welcome everybody. I'm very pleased to be able to talk about Canadian crayfishes, give you an update what's happening, I guess, north of the border. So I'm going to be talking about all of our crayfishes, try to cover not just Ontario where I reside, but also most of Canada. So, not for some reason, I can't move my thing. Okay, here we go. There we go. Okay, so crayfishes in Canada, we don't have as many crayfish species as down in the States, but we have altogether 15 species in 2 families and 6 genera. So on this slide, you could see in dark, you could see the natives in each province, and then the introduced species are the pluses. So Nova Scotia, for example, does not have any natives, but now has 3 introduced species. So Ontario has the richest fauna, followed by Quebec, and then as you go west, it's less and less. And I think Newfoundland is covered by the closed captioning on my screen. I don't know if it is on yours, but it has had a reported crayfish in it once. It was probably just a release of a white Procambarus clarkii that somebody caught in the wild, but there hasn't been any other crayfish, so officially they don't have. So just a quick intro to the life history. In Canada, crayfish probably do very similar things that they do in the northern United States. They start mating early in the spring and continue. Some species don't breed until midsummer. Some of the Cambarids, for example. So they hatch in late spring to late summer and are generally active from very early in April to late in October. And some of them have been recorded to carry their young, the larvae, over winter. For example, Cambarus robustus, you routinely find them with old broods of stage 3 young in the spring. So I'm just going to go through all the different species. The first one is Phallicambarus fodiens, the digger crayfish, which is one of the semi-terrestrial crayfish. You have those in the United States. In Canada, they range basically from Windsor to just east of GTA of Toronto. They actually are very close to where I live in the Kawarthas, and the furthest east record is at a place called Lindsay, Ontario, if you're curious about that. They are affected in Canada by, and they're only found in Ontario, only in southern Ontario. They're just south of Lake Huron. They are on the south shores of Lake Huron, but no further. And they are affected by urban sprawl and by road construction and so on, and wetland draining. And they have been listed as vulnerable by Canada wild species. So that's just a federal listing of different species. But as far as I could tell, it doesn't really afford them any official protection. The other burrowing crayfish that we have in Canada are again, they're only in southern Ontario, are the painted mudbug and the Great Plains mudbug. So they're in the genus Lacunicambarus, which is a fairly new genus to us here, and they're again, they live in wetlands, mostly on the shores of Lake Erie, but we've now found them north on the Bruce Peninsula, which is basically in Lake Huron as well. So they're probably all through Ontario. They're also on the Niagara Peninsula. They're again either listed as sensitive or unranked because of the the painted hand crayfish has been discovered so recently in Canada that it hasn't got a rank. Then we have the Cambarids. So we have two species, Cambarus bartoni. Here in Canada, they call it either the brook crayfish or the eastern crayfish. Not so much common because it's not very common. And here it lives mostly in rapids and waterfalls and swift streams. Cambarus robustus is the bigger of the two cambarids, and it's quite widely distributed in southern Ontario, in the shores of Lake Ontario and all the streams, as well as Georgian Bay, and it's been found even further north now. So and then the next species is in the genus Vaxonius. This is one of our more common natives, the northern clearwater crayfish. Again, it lives in rivers and streams around the Great Lakes, but couple of the things that are interesting about it in Canada is that it's being replaced very rapidly in southern Ontario by the rusty crayfish. And so it's been impacted really seriously, and it's disappeared in many regions. For example, where I live, in the Kawartha Lakes, it's basically disappeared, and we're looking at a monoculture of rusty crayfish. One of the really interesting things, and one of the things that I've actually studied and published on, is the white morph of this species that occurs only in Lake Simcoe, which is one of the smaller Great Lakes. It's just below Lake Huron, basically, and just east of it. And in this lake, this northern clearwater crayfish has a white morph, and it's not it's a leucistic crayfish, and it only apparently occurs in this lake. And again, it's being impacted. It's slowly disappearing because the rusties are invading from an adjoining lake, from Lake Couchiching, and they have replaced it again in most of the parts of the lake. So we're worried that it's going to disappear completely. Then another one of our natives is the calico crayfish. It's also called the paper shell crayfish, and that is a crayfish that can be around wetlands and can make chimneys. So it's often confused with the other two burrowers, and its distribution is often confused with the other ones. So people have to be careful when they're looking at chimneys, whether it's the digger crayfish or these crayfish. Another one of our crayfish is the Vaxonius virilis, the virile crayfish. It's also called the northern crayfish in Western Canada. They didn't call it the virile crayfish. It's the west. In the West, they called it the northern crayfish. It's one of our most common species in Canada. It's distributed all the way from the Maritimes to now British Columbia, which it has invaded just recently. And one of the interesting things about it burrows really extensively. And here on this slide, you have like a colony in a bank. This is the Wanapitei River in northern Ontario, where there are extensive burrows along the river, like hundreds of burrows that you can see here, that these virile crayfish shelter in. I've recently completed an invasive species risk assessment report for the British Columbia government, because these crayfish are invading. They have spread through Alberta, where they were native in only one catchment initially, apparently, and now they have are spreading throughout the province, even very far north. You could see that they're up here in the Athabasca region, and then in the Rockies as well, in one of the lakes. But they have now entered British Columbia. I don't know if you guys can see that, because for me it's covered by the closed captioning thing, and I can't move it. So, but hopefully you can see it, and it's invaded into southern British Columbia, and it's present there. And so the British Columbia government is looking at trying to control it, because they have their own native species, which is the signal crayfish. So that's just an interesting sideline to this crayfish. So now we're on to some of the invasive crayfish. So this is Faxonius obscurus, the obscure crayfish, which is found in rivers, lakes, and streams in Ontario and Quebec. It doesn't seem to have expanded greatly in Ontario, but it has replaced the northern clearwater crayfish, Propinquus, in some of the watershed, especially around Algonquin Park, which is one of the big provincial parks. I have two old maps. There's very little distribution data really on many of our crayfish, but this one especially. So this map here is Quebec, and this is Ontario. So we have some distributional data on it, so we know that it's spread around the province. But it also has been it has been misidentified very often because it's confused either with rusties or with northern clearwater crayfish, because it's very similar looking, and people can't
Dr. Hammer, so
get
sorry for interrupting.
tell them apart. Yeah.
But if the captions are bugging you, I think that you can disable the captions on your PowerPoint. I don't see any of your subtitles or captions on there, so it might be in your PowerPoint that that's causing you trouble.
Yeah, let me see. I can see the CC if I can turn it off. Hidden. Let's see if I can. It says hidden. I'll try that.
Hopefully that'll help.
No, it's still there. I think that's a different screen. It's all right. As long as everybody else can see them. I have them right in the middle of the bottom of my screen.
Okay, I don't see any, at least for my screen.
As long as the participants don't see it, it's fine. I should be able to remember what's hiding under that.
Okay, hopefully everyone else can see the screen entirely.
Yeah. Okay. So the next species is one that I think a lot of people know about. It's one of our main introduced species. It's the rusty crayfish. It's spread throughout Ontario, where it's replaced in southern Ontario. It's become a monoculture in many places, and as well as eastern Ontario, and it's moved northwest into Lake of the Woods area and crossed into Manitoba, and it's now crossed into Quebec, and it's spreading in western Quebec as well. So it's a very invasive crayfish. It does very well here in Ontario and in Canada, and I'm just going to show you the distribution spread. So it was first recorded by Crocker and Barr when they published their famous Crayfishes of Ontario tome. That was the first book on crayfishes in Canada, really. But it was about the distribution of crayfish in Ontario, and you could see the initial distribution was only five points in the Kawartha Lakes, actually, where I'm presently sitting, just north of Lake Ontario, and so there were only five localities known, and it was thought that they were introduced by Ohio fishermen fishing probably in Rice Lake, which is a big productive lake, very popular with fishermen from Ontario and US. So then if you go to 1970, it starts spreading a little bit, and it appears now in eastern Ontario and on the Bruce Peninsula. And then if you go, I'm having trouble advancing here. If you go to 1980, then you could see it's spreading in the region where it was initially reported, and it's appearing in other places, including in the far northwest near Lake of the Woods. And this was because as it became more abundant, people started using it for bait and started bringing it with them. So fishermen from the south probably brought it to the north and to the other parts of Ontario. And as it became abundant, it also was used by bait shops, and bait shops were actually selling it legally, and so it was spreading, and you could see it spreading. And by 1990, there's more records, and then by 2000, it's all over the place, all over southern Ontario. This is so, and it's also moved into Manitoba by 2007, likely from Lake of the Woods. And I just put in this insert for you. So the green dots are actually where we've looked for crayfish. So so you can see that the gaps in where the rusties are not because we didn't look for them there. They actually weren't there. One of the funny things is that in the furthest southwest part of Ontario, which is closest to Ohio, which is apparently their native state, they are not present in that part of Ontario, but they are present everywhere else. And this is the final map, and these dots just represent I don't know if you could see the numbers in them, but they represent just the number of occurrences reported in those areas. So, and the size of the circles roughly corresponds to the number of the records, and there's lots and lots of records of introductions of the species. So it's just shows you what happens to an introduced species that is basically left unchecked. And eventually the sale of live crayfish was banned in Ontario, and I'm still trying to figure out exactly what the date was, but it was somewhere around the early 2000s, I believe, that crayfish were banned as bait, and they weren't able to be sold. So just a couple of quick things. I looked at I did a study in the early 90s. I looked at density, and I looked at of rusty crayfish in this particular river there that you see on the lower left here. That had some of the highest densities that I estimated at almost 100 crayfish per square meter. So they're just at incredible densities in some of the rivers that they've invaded. Another problem with the rusties is that where they have invaded and started hybridizing with the northern clearwater crayfish, it's very difficult to tell the two apart, because they have really characteristics of both species. So they'll have coloration that's sort of like the northern clearwater crayfish. Some of them will have the rostra carina, which is a characteristic of the northern clearwater crayfish, but will have rusty, let's say, male gonopods and rusty spots. So you'll get these basically mixture of characteristics, and it's difficult to tell what you're dealing with. All you could do is say that it's a hybrid of some sort. So now we move on to the most recent invader, and I suppose the most famous. It's hit the news in Ontario. I've been interviewed on radio and television about it very recently, and that's the marmor krebs, or marbled crayfish, which is, as probably most of you know, is parthenogenic, reproduces asexually, and it's invaded many parts of the world. In Canada, it was sold not so much. Well, it was probably sold in pet store, but certainly was sold by aquarists online, and it has been found now in one place in Ontario, as well as one place in Nova Scotia. So it's in the sort of in the wild in both of those provinces. And it has only been banned, restricted in Ontario, Saskatchewan, and in Manitoba, which in Manitoba it's only import. So, which I guess means that if you possess it, you can have it, but you can't import it and any longer. So how did we find it? It's a pretty good story. It turned up on iNaturalist. The crayfish at the top right corner of the screen is the first photograph, and the crayfish just below it on the turf is actually the first actual first report. It was found by the groundskeeper who's in the inside picture. He found it walking around a soccer field, and then people didn't know what it was. The groundskeeper didn't report it, but the naturalist that saw it walking on the path put it on iNaturalist, and I saw it, and I figured out that it was probably a marbled crayfish. And so that was in 2021. So you could see the two spots where they were found. They were the ponds that the crayfish are in are just next to the soccer fields, just underneath that long arrow. I don't seem to have my pointer anymore for some reason. I can't see it. Okay. So moving on, just so what did we do? So we started monitoring them, and the following summer we got out there and put out traps. Here you could see the three ponds. They're stormwater ponds, and that are used for firefighting and water storage. So they're artificial ponds, luckily, and they're not connected to any streams or really permanent water bodies. So that's one of the good things about trying to contain this first population. So this population was the first population not only in Canada but also in North America. So the first summer, in summer 2022, we went out there and started looking for them. We did the eDNA and got positive hits of eDNA, but we could not find any crayfish, any live crayfish in the pond. So what we tried to do is the city and the ministry decided to drain the ponds. So they de-watered the ponds in the winter, over the winter time, but unfortunately the dewatering was unsuccessful because the following summer in the summer we found more crayfish walking near the pavilion. So the staff of the of the park found crayfish walking around the pavilion, and we started looking for them and sweeping, and we managed to trap some adults as well, one small juvenile that you could see, which looked like it was born that year. So there was evidence that they were breeding, and again, eDNA had positive hits in all three ponds. So then in the fall of 2023, we went out there and did more sampling, and we did get more crayfish, but only so we sampled not only around in the ponds that we knew they were in, but also in some of the surrounding like wetlands, and there's a pond across the road. And we were getting positive eDNA hits in those ponds, but not getting any crayfish. The only crayfish that we could find were in the original stormwater ponds. Now, the hits that we were getting, I think, in the other ponds are quite likely to be just from overflow. So if the water flows out of those ponds through culverts or something and gets to the ponds across the river, it may be causing the positive hits with the DNA. But because we haven't been able to find any crayfish outside of these ponds, but we were in the fall able to find young of the year. You could see them in the lid of that jar. They were tiny. They were obviously born that summer. So what do? Again in the following in winter, so in December, at the beginning of the winter of 2023, 2024, we dewatered the ponds again, and that resulted in finding a lot of dead crayfish on the mud. But unfortunately, our winter was not very cold. So we continued the dewatering into February when it got colder, and we found more dead crayfish on the mount. So we were obviously getting to the population, and there were obviously quite a few crayfish in there as well. Um, and then when we went back in the spring this year, unfortunately we managed to net more crayfish in the original ponds. We didn't get any in the traps, but we did well initially. But then we did trap them, and we also managed to net them with dip nets. We looked at all of the surrounding areas, even below the escarpment, which these ponds are above the escarpment, the Niagara escarpment, but we were not able to find any crayfish outside. So we will continue doing surveys this summer, and there's also plans to do big DNA sampling all over Ontario to see if we could get some hits for marbled crayfish in other parts of Ontario. So in the meantime, so that's the Ontario situation, and in the meantime, these crayfish also turned up in some goldfish ponds in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. They looked like they were shipped in with a shipment of goldfish, and were in this pond. There was also one single report, which my American researchers friends might know better what happened, but there was one report of a crayfish in New York State on iNaturalist 2023, and from what I know, that no more crayfish were found in that area, but I don't know if it's being monitored any further or not. So that's one of our big invaders. The second most recent invaders is also the northern clearwater crayfish, Procambarus acutus. It's established in breeding in Ontario. It looks like it's been on Pelee Island, which is an island in Lake Erie, and that island has a population that's been there since 2015, but nobody again was able to identify it. But we have reports since then, and it's breeding. And we've also now found it at 6 Mile Lake Provincial Park and at Port Severn, which are two areas in Ontario near Georgian Bay. They're actually directly connected to Georgian Bay, so these crayfish could be in Georgian Bay pretty soon if they're not there already. So this is just a quick distribution map of the the native distribution of this crayfish and introduced populations, which are the dots. The two red dots are the two Canadian populations that we found. Some of the crayfish on Pelee Island are huge, so we're concerned about them impacting not only our natives, but also some of the salamanders that live on Pelee Island. So how did they get here? We think that there's two vectors. The main one is probably angling, because both Pelee Island and the Port Severn region are popular angling places where anglers come for competition, bass competition. And so we suspect that someone might have brought them in as bait. And the other way they can get in is also just like the marbled crayfish, they can get in with shipments of goldfish. New Brunswick just reported that they got a shipment of goldfish from Ontario that had northern one of these crayfish in it, Procambarus acutus, northern white river crayfish. This is just a slide about Pelee Island. I've already mentioned that, so we're worried that they're impacting because they're so widely spread there, that they might impact two of our native species, the calico crayfish and the digger crayfish, but also these endangered salamanders that utilize crayfish burrows. And so Dr. Hosey, who I'm working with, also is now looking at the impact of these crayfish on the salamanders. So again, how did we figure out that these things were in Ontario? Well, we got I spotted them on iNaturalist, and I reported them to the invasive species hotline. And then in 2022, we visited 6 Mile Lake provincial area, and we only saw one crayfish. It was late in the season, so it was difficult. But so we went back the following summer, and we found them in 2 places, quite large populations. 3 places really, at Port Severn Park, at 6 Mile Lake Provincial Park, as well as the Port Severn Marina. We found females with eggs and crayfish of various different sizes. So we confirmed that they're reproducing. And they're also doing a lot of burrowing in the banks. So there's concern about their impact on shoreline erosion and so on. And these burrows were quite difficult to dig, but we were able to get crayfish out of them. So what did we do? We installed signs, posted signs about these crayfish, and as I said, we think that they're being introduced by anglers. So we're hoping that these signs will help in people reporting them and hopefully not releasing anymore. Again, we went back in September last year and got more crayfish. So I'm just going to go through. We sampled them, and I've already talked about this. So we got females with eggs that you could see in some smaller individuals, including Form 1 and Form 2 males as well, big ones, and so we know that they're reproducing. There's also a report that's not only in Port Severn, but much closer to Georgian Bay, which needs to be investigated. And also, I just put in this inset of the map there, basically on the border at Niagara. They're on the other side of the Niagara River in New York, so they could easily cross the border or be transported across the border by fishermen there. So we need to look for them there as well. Why are we worried about them? Well, they compete with native crayfishes. They probably would be predating on insects and mollusks, and so they would affect the aquatic food chain. I kept a couple of them in tanks where they happily fed on native crayfish that I had in with them, small native crayfish. So it's a big worry, because if they get into the Great Lakes, it will definitely affect our native crayfish. There's also been one report of these crayfish, well, of this actually the Procambarus onangulus, which is the southern White River crayfish. It's very similar, but they've been introduced into one lake in New Brunswick, so they're also in New Brunswick. I'm not sure whether they what's happening there, whether they I don't think they were able to fish them all out, but I'm not sure what is being done for control. We've tested ours genetically to see whether they were zonangulus or acutus, and they came up as 95% zonangulus and 94% acutus. So it's really difficult to tell the two species if they are species apart. So one of the last potential invaders is the Louisiana red crawfish. And again, to have a high impact, high invasion risk in all provinces. It's a very popular crayfish all over the world. It's cultured extensively in the United States and China for food. It's now prohibited in Ontario. It's not present, but we've intercepted some live shipments to restaurants in the Greater Toronto region. And it is present in British Columbia, so it's present in these ponds near a water treatment plant near the airport in British Columbia, and it has been there since 2017, as far as we know. Again, the reason we found out about this was through iNaturalist. So iNaturalist has been really instrumental for us to be able to track and confirm some of these introductions. They've also been now found in one lake in Halifax. And so there's a population there, and these crayfish are now being monitored and studied by Dr. Linda Campbell from St. Mary's University and her graduate student Madison Bond, and the Department of Fisheries and Ocean is looking at how to contain that population and stop it from spreading. I was just there at the invasive aquatic invasive species conference, and I had a chance to go on the field with Madison and with Linda, and we did. It was still a little bit cold in Nova Scotia, quite a bit colder than here. But I was able to see the lake. It's going to be very difficult for them to contain them. The lakes are all connected too, so there's a great possibility that these things could spread around in that region. And they're in these bogs. They're difficult to access. They were only able to trap them in traps so far, but we showed them the burrows, which were difficult to see if you're not familiar with the burrows, then they're easy to miss, but we were able to show them the burrows, and so they'll be monitoring them. And one of our next possible invaders into Ontario anyway, it's already present in New Brunswick and in Quebec, where it's spread from. In Quebec, it's spread from New Brunswick. This is the spiny cheek crayfish, which is famous for having brought the plague, the crayfish plague, to Europe and spread it there, which is a deadly disease for some crayfish. Anyway, it is on the border of Ontario. As I said, it's spread through Quebec. It came in from New Brunswick. It's not clear whether in the St. John River in the New Brunswick area it was introduced, or whether it spread naturally, or whether it was always present there. Because there hasn't been that much work done on crayfishes in Canada. Historically, it's difficult to tell, but it's possible that it invaded, and just judging by how it spread westwards, it's probably likely that it's invasive in all of those provinces. It is also in Nova Scotia now. So it's spreading west and east. It's in the St. Lawrence system and in the Ottawa River system. So it's likely to be in Ontario probably as we speak. The next species, well, it's of concern on the eastern part, but native to the west is the signal crayfish, which is native to western to British Columbia, and but it is a potential invader in our eastern provinces, and it has actually been reported by Minnesota DNR in in on this side of the Rockies. So we are worried about it, and Ontario has actually banned it, restricted it. So it's you're not allowed to be in possession of it in Ontario. So I'm getting close. I'm to the end. So crayfish, obviously a big concern worldwide. So I made this little map for you. You could see all these different invasive crayfish all over the world. You know, from Asia to Australia to Africa now. Africa has got crayfish, never used to have any, and now it's got many crayfish. And in Canada, it's no exception. We have 5 introduced species, so 30% of our fauna is on. So we need to do something about it. So what are we doing about it? There are no federal restriction on crayfish in Canada. The only crayfish that's restricted federally is the rusty crayfish, and that's only in Manitoba. So all the other restrictions or regulations, I should say, are all provincially provincial. So the common yabby and the marble crayfish are also listed on the least wanted AIS list in the Great Lakes region. As I said, they're all provincially regulated. In Ontario, we have probably some of the better regulation. We prohibit all Procambarus, which includes the marble, the red, the white river crayfish, as well as the Everglades crayfish. And we also prohibit all of Pacifasticus, as well as the common yabby, which is Chirax destructor, but not the other Chirax species. So in all of the provinces actually in Canada, crayfish cannot be transported dead or alive, but they can be used as bait in some provinces. In Quebec, they can only be used dead. Crayfish can be used and not rusties. And they are prohibited as bait in all the other provinces. So BC and Ontario are the only places where you can actually use them as live bait. So the regulations are complicated because they're different for every province. So it's, you have to go from province to province to figure out what the restrictions are. So in 2022, I was commissioned by the ministry to write up a report on the impact of any invasive crayfish in Ontario, and that resulted actually in the bans. So what I did, I looked at all 10 different species or groups of crayfish, and I rated many of them high. So I rated the signal crayfish, the Everglade, the red swamp crayfish, the white river crayfish, the marbled crayfish, the spiny cheek crayfish, as well as the rusty crayfish is high, and then the Allegheny crayfish and crayfishes of the genus Gambarellus and the Everglades crayfish is low. The reason I rated the Cambarellus and the Everglades crayfish is low was because they don't have a really extensive invasion history, and they're also mostly warm water species, which hopefully would not be an issue. The Chirax species I also feel are not a big issue because they would be controlled. Their spread would potentially be controlled with the crayfish plague because they're susceptible to the crayfish plague, and the yabby is already banned in Ontario, and the Chirax. The red claw Chirax seems to be doing well in places where there are no crayfish previously. So places like South America and Africa, they do well, and in the Caribbean, but there's not really a lot of reports of them competing with North American crayfish, as far as I know. So what should we be doing? We should be continue to educate people and post signage. We also made a new guide for people to be able to identify crayfish. Citizen science and reporting is obviously super important because that's how we figured out that we hit these invasives in Ontario anyway, and as well actually in British Columbia. So people reporting on the invasive species hotline or on iNaturalist or EdMaps is really important. We should continue some of the monitoring that we're doing now and expand it to more species than just a marbled crayfish. The regulations are great, but they have to be rigorously enforced and made clear to the public. And I think, personally, I think what we need to do is prohibit all of the invasive crayfish, which would include the rusties, which are not prohibited technically. Priority as far as safeguarding our remnant populations, I think should be trying to safeguard some of the headwaters of the streams where we still have natives left in Ontario, in southern Ontario anyway, and make sure that the rusties and any other crayfish are not able to spread. And then, of course, we need to do more research in crayfish, not only in Ontario, but in Canada. So, we're trying to do the thing I've given this winter. I've given, I think, 4 different seminars on crayfish biology, trying to educate people and biologists in different ministries and also federal biologists about crayfish, also enforcement officers. We were able to get a spot on TV Ontario, which was very well received, where we talked about invasive crayfish. And we produced this nice guide over the winter that hopefully will help people identify crayfish in Ontario, but also in Canada, because we've included all of the species that are potentially invasive or native to other provinces, which really is the only only really the signal crayfish. So just a little plug for the IAA, for the International Astacology Association. If you really want to find out about research in Canada, most of the papers that come out of Canada have actually been published in the freshwater crayfish, and I feel that sometimes they're overlooked for whatever reason, or not cited. But I've published 9 papers in freshwater crayfish on Canadian crayfish only, and I've also tried to put it into the crayfish news so that people can know what's happening in Canada. There's not a lot of research, but I'm hoping this is going to change soon. And with that, I will end, and hopefully I didn't put you to sleep like this hypnotized crayfish. So thank you for listening and watching, and I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hammer. That photo is hilarious. Definitely not boring. Definitely not boring at all. It was very fascinating. Thank you. So we have a couple of questions. We'll go right ahead and ask them. So what is the significance of having found triploid marbled crayfish in the wild? Are they typically diploid?
Yes. So the sorry, I mean, I didn't go into a lot of detail. So the crayfish are asexual, right? So they're triploid. So they have 3 sets of chromosomes. However, some of the latest research that's come out has shown that there are triploids also in the original population, which comes out of the Everglades. So the German researchers who worked on these crayfish, Dr. Leiko, he said that he found triploids females in the wild population of the sloth crayfish, which is what it's derived from. So the marbled crayfish is essentially similar to that crayfish, but it's triploid, and that's what makes it a different species. So it's got 3 sets of chromosomes, reproduces asexually. So one crayfish can spawn an entire population pretty quickly. That's why we're so worried about it.
Wow, and that's the Procambarus phalanx that you're referring to, the original species that the marbled crayfish
Well,
descended from?
Procambarus phalanx is the original species that it was derived from.
Mhm.
So I read a very interesting article, actually. It was not a scientific article. It was in Harper's Magazine. I don't know if anyone's come across it, but they talked about the scientific sleuthing that the German researchers actually did to figure out where this crayfish came from. And it came from some shady fish dealers who sold it to actually, he was, I think, a scientist in Germany who was interested in crayfish, and that's apparently where those original asexual crayfish in captivity came from. And they think maybe because they were exposed to really cold temperatures in the hold of a plane, that might have been that caused the mutation. Or so it's really interesting. And I talked to some of the geneticists here that I work with, and they said, yeah, subjecting crayfish to really cold temperatures, shocking them, induces mutations. This is well, they didn't say crayfish, they said organisms, that you can induce mutations in organisms by shocking them with cold temperatures.
Do you think that this could be possible with other crayfish species, or do you think this is just kind of its own case? Just
Well, I think it's its own case. I mean, I don't know. I'm not a geneticist. I'm an ecologist, but I think it's its own case. And I think the fact that that Dr. Lyko found these triploids in the population shows you that that particular crayfish has got the ability to be triploid naturally, if you know, because initially people said that it happened in the lab because, you know, someone was messing with crayfish or did expose them to something that caused them to be triploid, that caused the mutation. But it could be that that mutation is actually present in the wild. So, but it is not clear what's happening to those triploid females in the wild. They're not reproducing as far as they know. They're just occurring,
oh, interesting.
but
Um,
are not having broods, but they're triple.
I have another question for you. So you mentioned earlier on in your presentation that in the southern part of Ontario, kind of near Ohio, you did not find any rusty crayfish.
That's
Um,
right.
do you know why that might be happening? Were you able to sample the habitats and possibly measure water quality or substrate type?
We did. I didn't. So the studies that I did those surveys mostly, and then we have, you know, now we have naturalists, so people report, and they haven't reported any rusties from there. We have no reports of rusties. So the short answer is I did not sample water quality or habitat type, not scientifically, but all I did was I went to places and see if I could find crayfish, and I did find native crayfish down there, by the way, like in streams that were, you know, of reasonable quality. But a lot of the rivers down there, because it's a heavily agriculturalized area, are very eutrophic, so the water quality is quite bad there. So it's possible that that has something to do with it. But having said that, there are streams that are, you know, quite nice, let's say rocky streams that flow into Lake Erie, and they have native crayfish, but they don't have rusties in them. But,
Great, thank you.
you know, we have a lot of the burrowers in that region. So that's the other thing. And I think that, you know, it's probably has to do with the habitat, right? Like it's
It would definitely be
swampy.
interesting to see,
Yeah.
go out and check the habitat there to see if there's any variables that are impacting them. Um, Another question for you. How did you assess the impacts and risks of each crayfish? You mentioned that you created that report in 2022 to uh, kind of assess the risks of different invasives. Were there any specific tools that you used to help you with that
So
rating?
yeah, I looked at, basically did looked at the literature and looked at, you know, what different factors in the histories, whether they have a history of invasion, you know, what their habitat preferences are, and so on. So it was all literature based on unknown science, right? So it was heavily reliant on other people's data, obviously not. I use some of my data for rusties and so on, but there are studies also. There was a study that was done broadly for Canada, but funnily enough, and they did a really good job in terms of characterizing the habitats. So I was able to use that. You know, they were modeling for different crayfish, but they failed to consider certain things, like that the White River crayfish were already in Canada. So they missed that
Wow,
completely.
thank you.
So, you know, there was a lot of data, and some of it was good and some of it was no good. And so, you know, I had to wade through it and make the recommendations on top of that.
All right, that makes sense. It's really great that there were some that there were regulations that were produced after your report. Just shows the importance of researching these crayfish so that we can get them regulated if they do produce these severe impacts. So that's really great.
I think
And then, mhm,
Sorry, I think the regulators, they want to see the body of evidence. You know what I mean? Like they don't just want to say, oh, signal crayfish are potentially really bad. They want to know, okay, show us why are they bad? Like, so then you show them the European literature and, you don't, that's enough, I think. It's convincing enough to show their spread in Europe and, you know.
exactly, exactly. That's why it's very important to do the work that you and other crayfish researchers and managers are doing. So thank you again. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for today. If anyone has any other questions, feel free to email them to me and I'll make sure to forward them to Dr. Hammer. And I just wanted to say thank you so much again, Dr. Hammer, for giving us your time and just discussing the really crucial work that you and your colleagues are doing up in Canada. And a big thank you to everyone who attended. I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.